So there were two main witnesses the following day, medical witnesses. Dr. Lindsay Thomas, a forensics pathologist retained as another expert witness for the state, and Dr. Andrew Baker, the Hennepin County medical examiner who conducted the autopsy of George Floyd. Now, these were interesting choices by the state because the expert witness, forensic pathologist Lindsay Thomas, was presented first to the jury. And she'd never actually examined Floyd. Her professional opinion, her expert opinion, was based solely on the report done by Andrew Baker, the medical examiner. So why she was even needed seems odd. Well, you know why it wasn't odd? Because when the medical examiner, Andrew Baker, published his first report, it wasn't incriminating of the officers. So he changed his report at the request of the prosecution to make it incriminating of the officers. Obviously, this changing of his report undermines his credibility. So the state couldn't rely solely on the credibility of the actual medical examiner. Therefore, they brought in a paid expert witness, forensic pathologist Lindsay Thomas, to buttress the testimony of Baker. And they presented her first. So those would be the first words the jury would hear, not the very impeachable Dr. Andrew Baker, medical examiner. So let me pull this up so I can share this with you. And that is Chauvin trial day 10 wrap up. Even more reasonable doubt raised here. And this is still the state's case in chief. 10 days we're in now on the state presenting its witnesses and testimony. So I'll jump past a little introductory comments. In the case of both Dr. Thomas, the expert forensic pathologist hired by the state as an expert witness, who never actually examined George Floyd, and Dr. Andrew Baker, who was the medical examiner, who did the examination, who changed his report to make it incriminating. There was a common pattern in the nature of their testimony. On direct questioning by prosecutor Blackwell, they would both say the magic words they certainly knew the state needed them to say on the witness stand. In effect, and even literally word for word, they identified the primary cause of George Floyd's death as asphyxia, complicated by law enforcement's subdual, restraint, and neck compression. When asked on direct if any of the other notable factors everyone knew the defense would raise on cross-examination, the existing cardiovascular disease with 75% to 90% occlusion of all three major coronary arteries in Floyd's heart, the hypertension induced enlarged heart, the presence of fentanyl and methamphetamine in Floyd's system, 3 times fatal levels, the adrenaline induced by Floyd's poorly made decision to fight 4 police officers for 10 minutes. Could any of that have been the cause of Floyd's death? The answer of the state's medical experts was a flat no, period. Floyd's death could only be attributable to asphyxia complicated by law enforcement, subdual, restraint, and neck compression. Good testimony for the state, right? On cross-examination, however, both Doctors Thomas and Baker agreed that every single one of those other factors by themselves, even in the absence of police involvement or any other factors, if viewed in isolation, could be an entirely reasonable cause of death or an official death certificate of George Floyd. So below, I'm just amalgamating the responses of both Thomas and Baker as they were so similar. Video of their individual cross-examination is embedded below for those wishing a more granular sense of what each said. By the way, I believe these are all available. If anybody wants to read my coverage of the trial, they can go to lawofselfdefense.com/Floyd, Floyd, and we've aggregated all our George Floyd coverage there. Of course, I'll add today's show as well. So, continuing. In other words, had Floyd been found dead at home and an autopsy revealed 75% to 90% occlusion of his 3 major coronary arteries, would it have been reasonable for a medical examiner to attribute cause of death to that heart condition? And on cross-examination, the state's medical experts, Lindsay and Baker, both said yes. They were asked on cross, you signed thousands of death certificates listing cause of death as atherosclerotic disease in patients with similar levels of arterial occlusion as Floyd. Yes. You signed death certificates listing cause of death as hypertensive cardiomyopathy in patients that have similar degree of enlarged heart as Floyd. Yes. Did you tell investigators when interviewed that cardiovascular disease was a significant contributor to Floyd's death? Yes. If Floyd had been found dead at home and toxicology had revealed 11 nanograms per milliliter of fentanyl in a system, would it have been reasonable for a medical examiner to attribute cause of death to fentanyl overdose? Yes. Have you signed death certificates as overdose deaths in cases where fentanyl levels were at 11 nanograms per milliliter? Yes. Below 11 nanograms per milliliter? Yes. As low as 3 nanograms per milliliter? Yes. Would the presence of a combination of drugs like fentanyl and methamphetamine make overdose a more likely cause of death? Yes. Could asphyxia of the heart be induced by methamphetamine, creating a higher demand for oxygen by the heart than Floyd's body could deliver? Yes. However low the level of methamphetamine in Floyd's system, is there any level which is safe? No. Would you recommend methamphetamine or even prescription amphetamine for a patient with Floyd's cardiac status? No. Would this demand for oxygen of Floyd's heart and the inability of his body to deliver on that demand be worsened by adrenaline resulting from Floyd's physical confrontation with the officers? Yes. So even if we didn't or don't consider Floyd's exertion in fighting police, if we take the police out of the question entirely, pretend there was no impact made by the illicit drugs in Floyd's system, a reasonable call on cause of death was simply Floyd's existing cardiovascular disease and hypertension. Yes. What percentage of restriction of the coronary arteries would be potentially fatal? 70% to 90%. What was the restriction of the coronary arteries in Floyd's heart? 75% to 90%. Does a 90% stenosis of a carotid artery limit blood to the heart? Yes. Does adrenaline increase the heart's demand for blood? Yes. Does meth increase demand for blood? Yes. In the context of death being purportedly afflicted by subdual restraint and neck compression, Nelson also hammered on the absence of any objective evidence of actual force sufficient to achieve such a result. Was there any bruising to the back of Floyd's neck or back? No. Either on the surface or even deeper in the tissue? No. Would a knee and shin applied with substantial force be expected to cause a bruise? Yes. Would be expected, but absence of bruise doesn't mean it didn't happen. And that's true, of course, but one does not get to guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, explaining away an absence of evidence. So, I don't know if I want to read the entire blog post. These blog posts tended to be very large. So I'll continue a little bit, a few more paragraphs. Then, let's see. Then for both Thomas and Baker, the medical experts for the state, on redirect examination after cross, Prosecutor Blackwell, they would both once again parrot the magic words desired by the state. Despite everything they said in cross-examination, now they revert back to the script. Floyd's death could only be attributable to asphyxia complicated by law enforcement, subdual restraint and neck compression. Not the heart disease? No. Not the hypertension? No. Not the fentanyl? No. Not the meth? No. Not the fighting the police? No. Does that sound reasonable, folks? That redirect, those answers, given what we just heard on cross? Completely contradictory. Continuing, this generalized and simple-minded denial of the uncertainty and doubt raised in detail by the defense on cross once again may provide fodder for conviction-favorable headlines because the media just reports on that redirect, not on the cross-examination, but it doesn't push the needle closer to certainty beyond a reasonable doubt in court. And that is precisely the state's burden. Certainty beyond a reasonable doubt. Any ambiguity in the case necessarily accrues to the benefit of the defense, and the lengthy cross-examination of both Doctors Thomas and Baker revealed plenty of ambiguity. That, of course, all assumes a fair, impartial, unbiased jury interested in justice, which we obviously didn't have in this case. All right. So, key points here. No injury to Floyd's neck. The state's own use of force expert said the pressure was not to the neck, but to the neck area. And the picture shown in court showed Chauvin's knee on Floyd's shoulders and on his back. There was no picture showing the knee explicitly on the neck beyond any reasonable doubt. 3 times fatal fentanyl levels, as well as methamphetamine in Floyd's body, in his blood. He had just ingested a mouthful of pills when the police approached to avoid their discovery by police. To the point where when he was transiently placed in the patrol car and fighting police, eventually he would escape from the patrol car. When he was fighting police in the patrol car, he was spewing fragments of pills out of his mouth. He had pre-existing heart disease, severe hypertension that enlarged his heart, 90% occlusion of his 3 major cardiac arteries. The adrenaline from the large, powerful Floyd violently fighting off 4 officers attempting to make a lawful arrest for 10 minutes. This whole "I can't breathe" began. He began saying that, claiming that, while he was fighting the officers on his feet. And he still fought the officers for minutes more before he was finally put on the ground. Plus, of course, the presence of the angry mob on the curb that Tao was holding back simply by his physical presence. That angry mob alone interfering with police decision-making. All of that is why there was nothing like proof beyond a reasonable doubt of reckless manslaughter. And therefore, there was nothing like proof beyond a reasonable doubt of Officer Tao aiding and abetting reckless manslaughter. But nevertheless, witch trials happen, lynchings happen, and that's what happened in this case. And this past Monday, Tao was sentenced in front of the judge.